we have a new development out of Florida where Governor DeSantis has now commented publicly on sort of the relationship between the gun industry and the finance industry and the banks. And you have a piece about a statement that he made on what he plans to do. If you want to fill us in on what's going on.
Yeah, so DeSantis had a rally on Tuesday with the leader of this Senate, the Republicans in the Senate in Florida, and the Speaker of the House in Florida, who's also a Republican. And they talked about their proposal to enact regulations similar to what Texas has done with banking, which is to target banks that implement a ESG agenda. So basically they incorporate sort of social considerations into their business decisions. And so they don't do business with oil companies or private prisons or especially the firearms industry for our purposes here. But yeah, so he proposed, there's not written legislation yet, but the three of them said on the stage that they're going to effectively bar big banks that have these sort of policies from doing business with the state of Florida, right? So they're using Florida's municipal funds to combat this, what they call a woke agenda, right? From these large financial institutions. And so that means, we won't give them government contracts from the state of Florida. They won't keep the state of Florida's money in their bank accounts at these banks and stuff like that. So it's a fairly significant thing, mainly because of the size of Florida, right? Texas did this. And, those two states alone have quite a lot of economic power behind them. So, it's a pretty big cudgel, I guess you could say. And they're going to use it in this case to try and prevent banks from dropping gun businesses.
Yeah, no, I think it's definitely a big deal because obviously Florida is at this point a deep red state. I think after November, they now have a supermajority in the legislature. So obviously whenever a formal bill does get introduced, there's a good shot that it passes. And Florida, as you said, joins Texas as these two big red states with massive market potential that can kind of flex their muscles a little bit in the finance industry. And I think politically, this does a lot for DeSantis, who it has made some positive comments around guns and being pro-gun generally, but doesn't really have a long track record to show for. And obviously, I think everyone knows he has higher political aspirations. So I don't know what you think about that, how that helps his odds maybe down in a crowded primary field down the line.
Yeah, certainly. I think that this is part of his strategy on guns going into the Republican primary. But yeah, he is sort of shoring up his right on the issue of guns. They've also proposed constitutional carry, permitless carry in Florida as well, which he's supported in the past, but hasn't really made a push for in the same way that, Kemp did in Georgia. And Florida is one of the only triple red states that doesn't have permitless carry at this point. So he's kind of behind the curve on this issue. And now it seems like they're going to pass that bill, and he's incorporating the gun issue into his sort of anti-big bank agenda now as well. And I think that's all on purpose. It's fairly smart politics with the bank stuff, because he was already, likely to make these kind of moves over, other aspects of what the banks are doing. He accuses them of using a social credit system that disfavors, right-leaning businesses or individuals. And so they had a specific example during this event where Brandon Wexler, who owns Wex Gun Works, which is a story that we reported on, he was dropped by Wells Fargo. Wells Fargo had sent him letters that said he was a risk and that it was because of the industry that he worked in, which is, dealing firearms, but didn't give any further details as to what the risk was. And then later claimed that it doesn't have anything to do with the fact that he's a gun dealer and that they're committed to staying in business with gun companies. But obviously this created a lot of news and controversy. And so Wexler was actually there at this event speaking with the governor. And so he took this story, he took this, what happened with Wells Fargo, and is incorporating that into what he was already doing, which was using, sort of state government power to push back against corporations, large corporations that he thinks are woke or are, pursuing a social agenda that he doesn't like. Obviously he had the fight with Disney, and now he's doing a similar playbook with big financial institutions like Citibank or Bank of America and Wells Fargo. So it's fairly smart politics, I think, to do that, because Florida has a really good reputation for being pro-gun, but in recent years has really fallen behind the rest of, red America, at least when it comes to actual policy.
Yeah, I agree that it's very politically savvy. Regardless of the merits of the policy, it definitely plays well to the sort of brand he's been building. Kind of, as you pointed out, he sort of staked his reputation on the guy that's willing to fight against these, woke corporations or whatever, and to rope firearms in there, which is obviously going to be a big primary issue, at least on the Republican side. That's pretty much all upside, I think, for him for a potential presidential candidacy, trying to fend off other rivals. Like you pointed out, Kemp and Abbott. We don't know if they're going to run, but they're, at least potential contenders. And he's no longer vulnerable on those issues if he can, raise his profile doing things just like this.
Yeah, I mean, it's something that might turn off, your more libertarian leaning conservatives.
Right.
But I think over the last 4 or 5 years, you start to wonder how many of those actually exist, even if you are one.
Right.
And so for Republican primary voters, they definitely seem to want this sort of government action against the companies or groups that they perceive to be, their enemies or the people who are against them. Right. And so, this kind of combines that's been his real marquee thing as governor. And so this is a way to incorporate a new issue into that political strategy. And it probably is a pretty smart move in that regard for the people he's trying to appeal to. And, certainly it'll be interesting to see, like he's vulnerable on this issue to people like Kemp or Abbott in Texas who were ahead of him. But are they even going to run? Is this going to be more than a 3 or 4 person race by the end of things? How many other people are actually, further to the right on guns than he is? Because Trump has a fairly mixed record himself. Certainly, he instituted the bump stock ban unilaterally, which just got struck down as unconstitutional in the Fifth Circuit. He made a lot of comments after Parkland about taking people's guns and then having due process later. There was a lot of public comments. Obviously, at the same time, he's gone to every NRA convention. The NRA is kind of, in his pocket in terms of they're extremely tied to Trump at this point. And they're still, as we talked about before, the largest group despite all their struggles. And then, of course, he has the sort of Trump card, I guess, to say, of appointing 2 Supreme Court justices who have been, on the pro-gun side in this major landmark ruling we've covered extensively, in Bruin. So, certainly shoring up his position on guns with some actual accomplishments while he's, before this primary really kicks off would be smart politics.
Yeah. I think one thing that'll be interesting to watch is just how these banks react. Obviously, Texas passed this policy, and you saw like Citigroup, for example. I think that was like the big sparring partner with the Attorney General, Ken Paxton, over there, where he was going to review all the contracts with the state of Texas and review City's policies to see if they're in line.
And he said they aren't. He certified
right, and he decertified them from doing
even
business
though
with the state of
Citibank
Texas.
claimed that they were, sort of paradoxically, because Citibank hadn't changed their. So the core of this issue is like Citibank and Bank of America, for instance, had actual policies that they put out that they said they wouldn't work with companies that make AR-15s or or sell them, or same thing for magazines that are high capacity, although they don't define what that means. And it means different, it's just like assault weapon. It means different things depending on what state you're in or how people are defining it. These are nebulous terms. But so they've sort of wanted to use their bank's influence to try and force gun companies into, not making these legal products. And that's what a lot of people have gotten upset about over the years, right? And so that's where this all stems from. But Texas, the Attorney General there, as you mentioned, decertified them, or said that they weren't in compliance with this law. And it has repercussions on both ends, because Citibank can't do business in the largest state in the one of the largest, it's the second largest, right? In the country, and then so I think California's still bigger. If I'm remembering correctly. Yeah. But they can't do business there with the state government. At least they can still, operate in Texas. They just don't get state contracts. But at the same time, it makes doing state business more expensive, because they have to go out and find other banks, and so they generally get charged more money. But I think a lot of people who support these sort of policies see this as an intractable battle. Like if the financial industry shuts out the gun industry, how can you do business at all? And right. That's where I think the support for this comes from.
Yeah, especially when the big ubiquitous players like your Wells Fargo's, your Bank of America's, the ones that are in every state and usually have one of the largest market shares, shut you out. I certainly, see the appeal. I just wonder if we'll see more, like, for example, in the story that you wrote, Wells Fargo put out, I think it was from the last letter they sent to Brandon Wexler, where they said, oh, don't worry, we intend to continue doing business with the firearms industry. So we don't know if they're going to continue to put out symbolic statements like that, or maybe symbolic statements, or if they'll actually see a change in their lending practices and their banking practices.
Right. I mean, that's the thing about Wells Fargo, is that they never made one of these statements that they wouldn't do business with certain kinds of gun companies. They just have been accused, at least by the National Shooting Sports Foundation, for instance, of sort of backdooring a policy like that, where they do what they did to Wexler, which is like they cut ties, but they don't explicitly say that it was because you're selling certain kinds of guns they don't like. And so that's much harder to prove, obviously, especially if Wells Fargo comes out and says that's not what's going on. And so a law like this might be harder to use against a bank like Wells Fargo. And that's they're probably doing that in. It was interesting to see Citibank try to get certified in Texas anyway. They never came out and said they were changing this policy, but they tried to say that they were in compliance with what the technical rule in Texas is. The Attorney General, of course, rejected that. And that's probably what it'll come down to, is like, what is the Attorney General in these states? What do they decide about what constitutes complying with this sort of mandate? And again, this is about, it's sort of they're not trying to ban Wells Fargo or Citibank or any of these other large companies from doing business in the state. They're using government resources to, to say that we're not going to have our accounts with you. So it's probably safer in terms of, judicial review in that sense. The state can choose who it wants to bank with, but, they'd have a lot more trouble if they tried to, shut down Citibank in all of Texas or all of Florida. So it's a little more savvy than something like that, but it will be interesting to see how this plays out and what kind of effect it has. Because, like I said, it's doing damage to both ends, where, Citibank and Bank of America and Wells Fargo are going to have trouble getting these large state contracts. And at the same time, those states are going to have trouble getting the best rates when they go to finance debt or what have you. And so it'll be interesting to see how that plays out, whether one side blinks perhaps or what happens.